I'm JG Michael, and this is Parallax Views.
Hey Parallax Views listeners. I've had a flu the past few days, so this episode is coming out a few days later than expected, but I believe it's a good and a juicy one with Professor Alejandro Velasco of New York University and author of Barrio Rising, Urban Popular Politics and the Making of Modern Venezuela. On this edition of the program, Alejandro and I will be discussing the fall of Maduro, Trump's gunboat diplomacy, and perhaps most interestingly, what could be called the tale of two Venezuelas, that of the diaspora and that of those on the ground in Venezuela. Professor Velasco argues that nuance needs to be applied in discussing Venezuela and that there's not enough of nuance in many of the discussions we hear today about the country. So with that being said, let's get right to it with Alejandro Velasco. But before we do that, I'd like to remind you that you can support Parallax Views on Patreon at patreon.com/Parallax Views. It is you, the listener, that makes this show possible. I only have one sponsor. Otherwise, this show is entirely listener funded. So if you can, make a donation at patreon.com/Parallax Views. And also, of course, check out my sponsor, Mike Swanson, at wallstreetwindow.com. Wallstreetwindow.com is a great financial and trading newsletter. And I've had listeners personally tell me they've made return on investment thanks to Mike's trading tips. So if you can, head on over to wallstreetwindow.com, subscribe to the newsletter, and if you do that, you'll get a free copy of Mike's ebook, The Twofold Formula, the single best trading pattern I have ever used. And with that being said, let's get to the conversation with Professor Alejandro Velasco. Welcome back to Parallax Views. A guest that I'm very happy to have on again. Alejandro Velasco is Associate Professor of History at New York University, and he has been doing some of, I think, the best commentary on Venezuela that I've seen as of late. He has a recent article in The Guardian, Maduro is gone, but his regime is intact. What happened behind the scenes? And he's also just on social media talked a lot about what the recent events in Venezuela mean, and also what Trump's policies mean for Latin America. How are you doing?
Well, I'm reminded this past few days of a quote by Lenin that there are decades when nothing happened, and then there are weeks when decades happen. And so it definitely has felt like a long, long week. But thank you so much for having me on.
The first thing I wanted to get into is perhaps talking a little bit about Maduro and what made him different. What were the differences between Maduro and Chavez, and how relevant is that to what we see playing out now?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. So there were differences both in style and then in policy. In style, we knew those differences the very moment that Chavez handpicked Nicolás Maduro as his potential successor when he was sick from cancer after having won re-election in 2012. And what we knew at the time was that Maduro, in contrast to Chavez, was a far more staid, far more wooden figure than the charismatic, outspoken, very genuine Chavez, right? So that's in terms of style. In addition, we also knew that that Maduro did not have the kind of command over the various, sometimes competing factions of what made up the broad constellation of what we know as Chavismo. Military factions, civilian factions, economic factions, international factions. Maduro didn't have control over those in the way that Chavez did. And so that meant that his presidency would for sure be occupied by trying to consolidate control rather than simply assuming it. So those are the two major kind of stylistic differences. Over time, those stylistic differences joined up with policy differences that were both internal to what Maduro felt that he needed to do to cement his own position in power, but then also external to Venezuela and especially to Venezuela's economy, which he had to fend with. And of course, here I'm speaking specifically about, number one, the collapse in the price of oils, which Hugo Chavez had enjoyed at a very high level for most, if not all, not certainly all, but most of his presidency, and which Maduro then had to contend with very soon after he became president when oil prices collapsed in 2014. And then, of course, the impact of U.S. sanctions on the economy, which exacerbated massively already deep problems within Venezuela's economic landscape. And so what that meant in terms of how Maduro was going to shift what had been Chavez and Chavismo's earlier vision of governance, which was meant to redistribute the riches of oil wealth in a way that felt much more equitable than had been in place in prior administrations. That shifted significantly under Maduro, who, because again of his kind of very relatively weak political position when he came into power, and then his weak economic position, meant that he needed to make a choice. Do I choose, as oil revenues are declining, as oil expenditures are increasing because of sanctions, am I going to choose to try to keep some level of popular support by way of distributing ever meager resources to the population that has sustained the movement of Chavismo? Or am I going to entrench my base, not among the people, broadly speaking, but among these power players that I have to keep happy if I'm going to stay in power? And he chose the latter. And he chose the latter in part because the opposition at this time, which of course has long been a very significant feature of Venezuelan politics, but seeing and sensing the weakness institutionally and politically of Maduro as soon as he became president, became a lot more powerful. And so that, for Maduro, especially in terms of siphoning resources away from, say, the state missions and programs that Chavez had created, and more towards military, police, intelligence forces, corrupt officials in the administration, et cetera, that had a couple of effects. The first one was to, again, cement power around him and create loyalties that were not about ideology, but that were about staying in power. But two, essentially giving a stake to other players and just himself to remain in power as well. Because the more they resorted to corruption and increasingly repression in order to stay in power, the greater the potential and the exit costs in the event that they were ousted from power, right? And so, the kind of broad political project of Chavismo, which was about creating a very strengthened executive. It always had a kind of authoritarian strain, but it was held in check with a much more democratizing, participatory strain. The participatory democratizing strain was completely sacrificed under Maduro, progressively at first, and then significantly later on.
Does this get into, I think you've said this elsewhere, but you've sort of described the transition to Chavez, from Chavez to Maduro, I think in a recent interview with Doug Henwood, a friend of the show, as being a transition from like a socialist state to just a patrimonial state.
That's right. And if we think about, and I'm certainly not the first person to talk about, there's many others who've written about the patrimonial state in Venezuela. If we think about it in those terms, what it really means is that the Venezuelan state, which is to say, as the purveyor of resources and services that are funded primarily through the extraction of natural resources, in particular oil, but not only oil, other natural resources as well, minerals like gold and lithium and others. The primary function of those around the state are to extract as much rent as possible from the state. So the state is no longer a vehicle through which the government distributes the rents of oil to the population at large, whether it's through political parties or through loyal favored channels. It's primarily it exists in order to be extracted directly from players. And that goes from, and as I mentioned to Doug, it goes from the most everyday bureaucrat who gets a kickback from whatever engagement you want to have with the state at any level, to the 4-star general who commands a significant amount of economic power because they've been given, very favorable concession by Maduro, right? So the state really becomes a kind of feast upon which others extract in order to satisfy their own greed. And that's the transition that we see from a socialist state to a patrimonial one under Maduro.
I also wanted to ask you, when it comes to how different spheres of, the American political spectrum view Venezuela, where do you think, I'll be blunt here, where do you think the hard right gets Venezuela wrong? Where do you think the hard left or even anti-imperialist left gets aspects of Venezuela wrong? And where do you think the center gets things wrong? I know that's complicated. That's like a three-parter, but
Yeah. I mean, in a way, there's a common thread to all of them. And this might be, a little bit too abstract, but hopefully not. The thing that everyone gets wrong about Venezuela, whether they're on the left, the right, or the center, is assuming that the story of Venezuela, its rise as a socialist powerhouse and its collapse as this, authoritarian dictatorship, is an easy story of winners and losers, heroes and villains, good and bad, right? That there's some kind of, at any given moment who the good guys are and who the bad guys are. Who those are may change, right? But the script remains the same. And in fact, the story of Venezuela, going back to before Chavez, is far more riven and far more complex. And it's the absence of the complexity, regardless of your ideological position, in most commentary, analysis, or thinking about Venezuela, that then in powerful ways facilitates analytic and eventually policy mistakes about what to do. I'll give you one quick example. So, if you're the Trump administration, or before that, if you're the Biden administration, if you have a clear sense of who the good, quote unquote, good guys are and who the bad guys are in Venezuela, then that's going to shape your policy agenda on how to affect, for instance, political change in Venezuela. Oh, the opposition, they're good, they're like us, they like us. The government, bad, they're repressive, authoritarian. The challenge is that both things can be true at the same time. And of course, we see this very dramatically over the events in the last week. It can be true simultaneously that, for instance, Venezuelans support the ouster of Maduro, for whom there is very little love lost, and at the same time oppose U.S. military intervention in their country. Like, multiple seemingly contradictory things can be true at the same time. And that's something that, again, whether you're in the left, right, or center in the United States, seems to keep getting missed. Now, more concretely, there are other things that, we can talk about these various, ideological camps. The right, what they primarily get wrong about Venezuela is that they assume that the opposition, which they, hoist as a kind of liberatory opposition, is, democratically or even liberally inclined. And that's just not the case. There are various factions within the opposition. Some are as, if not more, authoritarian than the authoritarian governments in power in Venezuela. What the left gets wrong is they assume, oh, and this also is something true to both the left and right in the United States. They assume that Maduro ruled over a deeply socialist state. And that's just not the case. No one who, unless they are trying to mischaracterize facts on the ground, can call Venezuela socialist. Today, a year ago, 5 years ago. And so when the right deploys socialism as a kind of boogeyman in Venezuela, they do so with a particular interest in mind, and that is to, of course, paint all of socialism in a negative light. When the left talks about socialism in Venezuela, they do so as a way to project a sense of anti-imperialism. The only reason why, the United States wants to overthrow the government is because it's a, socialist government. But that also creates an analytical mistake insofar as they trump, so to speak, conditions on the ground in favor of an anti-imperialist message that doesn't actually resonate with people on the ground in Venezuela who very overwhelmingly oppose the government of Maduro, and certainly Maduro himself. So there's all sorts of ways in which again, these various factions in U.S. politics get Venezuela wrong.
Do you think there's also a sort of a tale of two Venezuelas that goes on? What I mean by that is there a difference between the experiences and viewpoints of people on the ground in Venezuela and maybe the Venezuela diaspora in the United States?
There is, in fact, and I'm writing an op-ed exactly along these lines for the New York Review books, which does cast, let me put it this way. It starts, I hope it begins the conversation, I hope, especially in US media, that whenever we speak of, say, the opposition, we are contributing to a deep problem in Venezuelan politics, which is to assume, again, as I was suggesting before, that the primary cleavage, political cleavage in Venezuela is between those who oppose, certainly Maduro, Madurismo or Chavismo, and those who support it. And in fact, what we have seen, certainly over the last 5, 10, 15 years, but very much so over the past few weeks, and most especially over the past week, is a different fissure, which is between the opposition that is in Venezuela and an opposition that is outside Venezuela. And the center of gravity of the opposition, broadly speaking, in Venezuela shifted from a domestic sphere to an international sphere right around 2018. This was the lead up to what eventually became the Juan Guaido interim government affair, where Juan Guaido, who was a kind of backbencher opposition politician in the National Assembly, declared himself president following contested presidential elections the year before, and he was backed by the United States, many governments in Europe and Latin America, and eventually, that quote unquote interinato or interim government collapsed under the weight of its own fiction, because on the ground, who remained in power was Maduro and the people around him. But it again kind of compelled others around Guaido to make policy decisions that were based on fiction rather than on reality. But the most significant impact of that, again, was to splinter the opposition from one whose interests are primarily abroad and therefore whose incentives are abroad, from one whose interests and incentives are domestically. What's the difference between the two? For Venezuelan opposition in Venezuela itself, the way to articulate an opposition to the government is primarily through democratic means, which is to say, to build a political majority upon which we can then delegitimize the government and build an alternative. If you're abroad, the primary incentive is just to get rid of the government at all costs, right? Especially if there are friendly voices in governments elsewhere who are egging you on and saying, absolutely, what do you need? We can do this. right? And so
Is
as a
this, by the
result,
way, is this like a similar situation to what we have with maybe the Cuban American diaspora?
very much so, and it's unsurprising that the most radical strains of what I would say are the Venezuelan expatriate opposition are centered in the same place as the Cuban American opposition, which is to say Southern Florida. But it's not just Southern Florida; it's places like Madrid and Spain. It's places like Chile. It's places like Argentina. The Venezuelan diaspora has spread elsewhere rather than just Florida, which is the primary site of opposition politics for Cuban expats and has been for decades and generations. That's not quite the case with Venezuelans who have spread much more broadly. That's why you have Spanish politics, which is to say Spanish from Spain, have a strong third rail of Venezuela imbuing its own domestic affairs. That's why, Cast in the incoming president, right-wing president in Chile, has made such a big deal out of Venezuela in Chile and the Chilean elections. True also of Argentina, right? So, all of this is to suggest that the influence of Venezuelan expats from earlier generations, wealthier, whiter, more professional, more cosmopolitan, English speaking in many ways, essentially me. That these Venezuelans are fundamentally different and have different incentives than Venezuelans in Venezuela who have a lot more at stake in terms of being repressed, being arrested, being targeted for elimination, et cetera, right? So that certainly creates a significant cleavage, which has deeply widened over the past few days as there are folks abroad who openly celebrate, again, not just the ouster of Maduro, but the armed bombing of their country. And then those in Venezuela who celebrate the ouster of Maduro, but can't get behind the way in which it happened.
I also wanted to ask you, with Maduro now in custody, two figures that are being talked about a lot is one, the interim president now, Delcy Rodríguez, and also on the other end, Machado. What should we know about these two figures? I hope that's not a dumb question, but I feel like we're hearing all about them now, but we weren't necessarily in past years.
Right. So Delcy Rodríguez is a fascinating political figure, and let me tell you, um, between her and Machado, I had neither of them on my either 2025 or 2026 bingo card figuring quite as prominently as they have. Certainly not Machado winning the Nobel Peace Prize, and now Delcy Rodríguez becoming president of Venezuela. Now, to start with Delcy, she has a long career in not just Venezuelan politics, but really in Venezuelan leftist circles. Her lineage, as it were, her father was a leftist guerrilla in Venezuela who fought in the 1960s and 70s guerrilla struggles there, was eventually assassinated by the government in power at the time. She studied law in Europe, returned to practice law in Venezuela, but did so at a moment when Venezuela was entering a deep state of crisis, and so that many of the critiques of the governments in power that her father, her assassinated father, had levied against the state, she now saw being borne out in practice. And that's really what led her into politics under the wing of this nascent political movement led by Hugo Chavez. And so she quickly rose through the ranks of that movement to become, an assemblywoman, helped to usher in the new constitution that was passed in 1999. And then through the years become more and more prominent, especially around the reshaping of the legal system in ways that were more amenable to the project of 21st century socialism that Hugo Chavez was spearheading. When Nicolás Maduro becomes president following Chavez's death in 2013, she, especially given her depth use of or her connections with the courts, but also with in the National Assembly, became a really prominent figure for Maduro in terms of trying to gain control of the civilian factions of Chavismo. Over time, as the crisis deepened, the economic crisis deepened, she was an instrumental player in two ways. First, by becoming president of PDVSA, the national oil company, at a time when, of course, PDVSA was under sanctions. And so she had to really straddle a very fine line between maintaining friendly relations with some of the foreign oil companies that remained in Venezuela, including Chevron, which is the only U.S. oil company that has remained during this entire time, but a couple of other European ones as well. But then also, of course, negotiating deals with China, Russia, India, and others to, place Venezuelan oil. But the other way in which she, was really prominent in terms of the economy was to help shepherd Venezuela's economy from the bolivar, the currency, to the dollar, so to the dollarization of the economy, which was significant because, of course, that helped to move the country away from hyperinflation towards at least some degree of economic stability at a huge cost, of course, but nevertheless, also a significant benefit. All the while, she has maintained publicly an extremely strident kind of public presence as somebody who inveighs against the evils of empire, the United States, the benefits of socialism, et cetera, et cetera. And so, while at the same time maintaining this more kind of pragmatic part of her, and so in a way, she's really well positioned to navigate this moment of deep uncertainty and lots of contradictions. Machado, who was the other person that you asked me about, is also, much like Delcy Rodríguez, a long-standing figure in Venezuelan politics, but in some ways the mirror opposite of Delcy, insofar as her politics have been always to the right, and her presence in politics have always been at the service of trying to bring about a liberal, neoliberal, or now much more explicitly right-wing political project in Venezuela that's centered around privatization of its resources, privatization of its state services, et cetera, et cetera. And in order to do that, she, like Delcy Rodríguez, has kind of oscillated between more radical and more practical moments and sides where, she supported the coup d'etat against Chavez in 2002. She led the recall referendum against Chavez in 2004, alleged fraud, which was never proven, but was sufficient in terms of her standing enough to convince opposition politicians in 2005 to boycott parliamentary elections, all of which then helped to give Chavez complete control over the state, helped to lead, violent street protests in the streets known as guarimbas at various moments, eventually became a National Assembly member herself in 2015, and ever since then has again kind of played this kind of radical opposition role where she has again and again said there's no point in negotiating with the government because it will never cede power. And eventually, it seems like that has been her biggest impediment to reaching power, at least with the Trump administration, which realizes that they're going to need to negotiate with the figures who remain and who control the state apparatus. They can't rely on kind of a radical who wants to redo the state completely. And as a result, she has found herself marginalized in this moment.
If you can stay a few more minutes, I did have a few more questions. The big one is, what do you make of all the reasons given for this action in Venezuela that the Trump administration took on? I know a lot of people are saying it's all about oil. I'm not as sure of that. I think that may play a role, but I'm curious, what do you think is the impetus behind all of this? And do you think it's even necessarily Trump driving it? Because I get the feeling it may be a Marco Rubio sort of project.
Well, I think what we've seen is the convergence of different agendas landing quite literally on Venezuela for different reasons and to move forward different projects. I think the last one to come around is Trump. But of course, Trump is the one who counts most at this moment. And so therefore, how he's shaping or reshaping the motivations and the impetus is significant. But I do think that the primary driver of an agenda around Venezuela is Marco Rubio. And this has been true since the first Trump administration, when Rubio, as at the time, not Secretary of State, but as senator from Florida, again, hearkening to his contacts with Venezuelan expats in Florida, but also, of course, drawing on his own personal pedigree as a Cuban American himself, has long held a view that the left in Latin America, whatever its guise is an error, is a mistake, and needs to be eradicated. He understood when Trump came to power in his first administration that Trump could not care less about Latin America, and certainly would not care about Cuba, which had nothing to offer materially either to Trump, who primarily cares about material interests, or to the United States. It would only be, or it would primarily be, an ideological prize in a larger view of the continent as one that had historically been riven by ebbs of left and right. And so to the extent that Cuba, for the 20th century and to some extent the 21st century, occupied this kind of exemplar, this kind of beacon of a particular type of left in Latin America, if we can get rid of Cuba, we can get rid more broadly of the left. But we cannot sell Trump on ideology. So what can we do? And he sets his eyes on Venezuela, which had been keeping Cuba afloat through the delivery of oil, oil concessions and highly discounted oil since the Chavez years. And to say, well, if we can overthrow the government in Venezuela, which Trump might care about because of its oil, then it'll be far easier to either convince Trump or to have Cuba just collapse on its own, which is kind of what we're seeing playing out, at least over the last week. So I think for Rubio, he was the primary driver of this particular agenda, which again, I think is far more ideological in nature than it is materially inclined. The other one that's driving this agenda is Stephen Miller, who some people have suggested was the architect behind the National Security Strategy document that was released in November, and which really articulates in a very brazen way a vision not only of the Western Hemisphere, but really the world, in which the United States doesn't just exert power through hegemony, which had been, I think, the preferred mechanism for the better part of the 20th century, but reasserts its manifest destiny, to use that term, over the entire hemisphere as one that we exert not only control, but rightful domination over. So when he says things like, countries that have natural resources should not be selling it to China, he's not just saying like, hey, we are a trusted partner. He's saying, why, if we have the rightful claim over those natural resources, and if you try to sell them to somewhere other than the Western Hemisphere, and in particular us, then you are suspect and therefore susceptible to be targeted, right? And so, that's all to say that for him, his project is far more about hemispheric and then eventual global, domination of really asserting the U.S.'s, power in a very naked way. And then you have Pete Hegseth, whose primary agenda, even though it's cartoonish and of course highly lethal, but significant, which is he just wants a war. He wants a war to, to put to the literal flexing of muscles that we see, when he takes his shirt off and goes, training with the Navy SEALs or whatever. He just wants a war to showcase the U.S.'s shiny equipment and military prowess, right? And they see in Venezuela, in that they can overturn the government in Venezuela, they see an easy win that would allow them to, move forward these agendas. Trump is the one who comes last, right? He comes last and he comes latest. And what he says is, I don't care about any of that, although it is kind of interesting. What I really care about is, what does Venezuela have in its subsoil that I can personally derive benefit from? And that is oil, right? And so, everything, every other pretext that we've heard over the past few months, democracy, immigration, security, whatever, terrorism, all of that is pretense for what are far more insidious agendas driving what's happening in Venezuela right now.
Before we close out, what are your greatest concerns moving forward? And is there anything that you think has gotten missed in the course of this discussion or the broader discussion that everyone is having about Venezuela, about the capture of Maduro? Where do you think people are maybe missing the mark a bit? And where do you think we should be keeping our eyes right now? Because it's very difficult. This is a moving sort of target type thing.
Yeah, it's a great question. I appreciate it. I mean, we have to continue to, as much as possible, try to keep focused on what's happening in Venezuela to Venezuelans themselves. There was, as you said, the capture, the seizure, the kidnapping of Nicolás Maduro. But the rest of his government remains intact. There's been now a kind of new wave of repression that's been unleashed against journalists and others who've voiced their support for the ouster of Maduro, while at the same time you have some really important concessions being made, not only in terms of oil, but also in terms of the release of political prisoners. So, for Venezuelans on the ground, the situation, it's not just that it's uncertain, it's that it's confusing. What actually changed? What's different from Saturday to today? And so I think to the extent that we can understand that whatever other geopolitical machinations we can talk about, they have real impact upon people's lives in the ground. Some of whom, of course, lost their lives last weekend. Upwards of 100 people are now, reported to have died through the attacks. Most of them, part of the entourage of the security detail for Nicolás Maduro. Many of them Cubans, but also collateral, quote unquote, collateral damage. Folks who live next to sites where missiles dropped or bombs dropped, right? And so, these are real lives that are at stake. And so, to the extent that we can keep as much as possible centering those experiences seems really important. But the other one, as I was mentioning before, is it is both requisite and absolutely urgent that, especially in the United States, we try not to reduce what's happening in Venezuela to simple narratives, and rather to lean into nuance and complexity, right? That we try to resist the urge to say, this person is a good guy, this person is a bad guy, and that's all there is to it. There's a lot more messiness that's characterized as Venezuelan politics. And to that extent, I think it's important to, again, just bear in mind that the world that we see, and especially when it comes to foreign interventions, is far more complicated than we might otherwise want to imagine. And even if it's harder to decipher, it's therefore, for the same reason, more important that we do so.
I also wanted to ask you, and I promise this will be the final question, but do you see any possibility? I mean, maybe this is too broad, but is there any possibility of Venezuela at some point in the future that isn't caught between sort of this neoliberal privatizing opposition and the sort of Maduro state?
It's hard. It's hard to imagine that as a possibility in certainly in the short term, and maybe in the medium term. Most of the academic literature on political transition, successful ones, highlight that these are long processes. And I think part of the problem in Venezuela is beyond ideology, beyond political positions. It's one of time horizons, which is to say, if we think about a transition as something that takes time, if we think about a transition as something that requires negotiation among otherwise warring factions, and therefore concessions that make to either party seem difficult, then is there enough, not even political will, but is there enough patience to see that process through, right? I do think that with Maduro out of the picture, a political game that seemed stuck now has the possibility of introducing new opportunities that seemed impossible just a week and a half ago. For instance, the release of political prisoners did not seem possible a week and a half ago, and we've seen that. The potential return of U.S. companies to drill oil in Venezuela did not seem possible necessarily a week and a half ago, and now it seems imminent. Of course, it's all coming now with the additional factor of U.S. presence directly or indirectly in Venezuela.
Right. Sort of this return of gunboat diplomacy. Yeah.
Exactly. And so that raises a different specter where it's not Venezuelans themselves sorting out their future through painful agreements, negotiations, etc. They're doing so with this threat of force coming from abroad, right? And so, I do think that ouster of Maduro has created new opportunities, but the way in which he was ousted forecloses the same opportunities that might otherwise have been promising. And so personally, I don't feel very hopeful. And I very much hope to be wrong.
Do you think there will be opposition to more of this style of gunboat diplomacy in Venezuela?
Certainly in Venezuela, though much remains to be seen in terms of how it plays out. But the real question is not so much in Venezuela. It's what will happen, will there be more opposition to this in other parts of Latin America and in other parts of the world, right? Will Europe, for instance, stop wishy-washing about whether or not a country has a right to go in and take out another president, and instead call this what it is, which is a violation of international sovereignty? And if it is, then, you can say everything you want about Maduro, but if you are not clear on the violation of international law that just happened, then you're opening the door for further violations of international law. So now Europe is in a very strange position where just literally days after they said, well, we can't really say or speak about what happened in Venezuela, other than we hope that it returns to normalcy soon. Instead, and then a few days later saying, but you cannot make any threats against Greenland. It feels, and doesn't just feel, it is in fact patently contradictory, right? And so, yes, I think there's opposition to greater U.S. intervention in Venezuela from Venezuelans themselves, but they might be more bullish about it if they see economic recovery. But the damage to the international order that an armed intervention illegal by another country on another country does to the future of stability in the world is far too great. So a lot will be, dependent on what we see from other countries.
I like the way you put it. In November of 2024, you said, Marco Rubio is Secretary of State. Brace yourself, Latin Americanists. It's going to be a bumpy ride. And I think that even applies beyond Marco Rubio now. But I'll leave it at that. And thank you so much, Alejandro, for coming back on Parallax Views.
All right, thanks, Michael.
A special thanks to my $10 and above tier supporters on Patreon, who make this show possible with their generous donations. Producers' credits shout out to those supporters: Aaron, Jeremy, Matt, Big Bob's Beepers, James, Enoch, David, Sadad, Tristan, Bob, Eva, Miriam, West Bank Robbery Pod, B. Lund, Transnatural Perspectives Podcast, Dan, Nick, Elliot, Fabian, Tom, Arlen, Bo, Spartacus, James, G, Jamie, Will, JC, WV, Sutra, Orc, Catherine, Darko, Nathan, Holland, Dan, Mark, Chase, Olm, Gary, Emilia, Nick, Brace, Michael, and Brian. Please join those listeners in supporting me at the $10 and above tier of my Patreon page, patreon.com/parallaxviews, if you'd like your very own producer's credit on each and every edition of the program.
Until next time, you've been listening to Parallax Views with Parallax Views to Parallax Views with Parallax Views.
The way out is not simply to say, don't do it. just to prohibit. If nothing else, if we don't do it, others will be doing it like crazy. So, we have to confront the problem. But no, basically, I know of the great anxieties, problems, new forms of control, but it's also new forms of freedom. This is why I always emphasize that internet and all this new digital stuff, it's a very ambiguous phenomenon, but it's the field of struggle. New forms of enslavement, but at the same time, new incredible forms of freedom. We have to accept the fight with no nostalgia for old, allegedly more authentic communities or whatever. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid.